Stephen Brueggerhoff.
All right. Boone, thank you so much for the introduction. I certainly appreciate all the support from our colleagues like Boone Holliday, Ginger Easton Smith down in Nueces County, Lindsay Munyon from the district. We're here to help you and support all of your efforts in gardening. We're here to help you improve the skills you already have. Now, today's program is brought to you, of course, by Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Aggie Horticulture. I'm your horticulturist down in Brazoria County, so if you're down here, just stop by my office or give me a call. I'd love to talk to you. Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service offers practical how-to education programs based on university research to help your quality of life, and we do that through signature programs like the EarthKind and EarthKind Landscaping Program. We have research with EarthKind. We also have identified those techniques and skills that are quality skills to help you, and sustainable skills to help you be a better gardener. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about location. You know, it's all about location when we're talking about native plants. Of course, we got to look at the rock stars of the native plant world. We'll show you some images and some of plants that may be relevant and appropriate for your landscape. And then we'll provide you with some resources at the very end. This program will go about 40 minutes, I anticipate, and then we'll reserve some time for Q&A at the very end. So thanks again for joining us today. Now, we all know it's about location, right? If you go out of the state of Texas, or even if you go across the breadth of Texas, you're going to get different opinions about where you live in Texas. Texas is a huge state. It's very, very big. I lived in Washington State for a little while going to college. And when I was talking to people from the western, northwestern part of our country, or meeting other people from other parts of the country or even the state, I'd ask them, what do they think Texas is, right? And of course, we celebrate agriculture and we celebrate the cowboy life, but they think that there's a cow in every backyard and a cowboy in every pocket. And of course, I'd ask my colleagues or students while I was there, I said, what do you think the landscape of Texas is like? And of course, they would tell me, well, it's desert. And I challenge you to try to guess what kind of plant comes to mind. When you're talking to somebody outside of our region, outside of Texas, you ask them, what is a native plant of Texas? What do you think they might say? Well, the first response that I would get is cactus, right? But there's a certain kind of cactus that seeps in their mind, and it's a plant that does not even grow in our borders. Saguaro cactus. I borrowed some of these images from the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center. I worked there for a little while, about 8 years, a great association and a great organization. But of course, there's a misperception about what a native plant is from those people outside of our state, even within our state, and what plants may be appropriate. And it really all depends on your location. So these are images that I took out at a nature center, preserve called Armand Bayou Nature Center. Had an opportunity to go there this weekend. And the one thing I really like about the Armand Bayou Nature Center is they've got a great representation of different, I don't know if ecotones is the right word. Certainly they have different vegetative zones within that property. The property itself is right up against Armand Bayou, which feeds into Clear Lake, which is part of the part of our channel that goes out to the Gulf. And so they have woodland trails. They've got wonderful representation of native plants along those woodland trails up in the upper right-hand corner. In the upper left-hand corner, they've got a great representation of a pasture or prairie ecosystem, and a lot of native plants out there that are appropriate for that area. Picture on the bottom left-hand side, you can't tell, that's my wife, Charlotte. This is a view out towards the water itself. And of course, once you start getting into the deep understory, the spooky deep understory of some of our forested areas or bottomlands, you start getting into a different suite of plants. I think some of our challenge, possibly of maybe connecting with nature, is understanding what those plants are, being able to identify them. If you go out to a prairie, you may not be able to identify 9/10 of the plants that are out there unless they're flowering. Stephen B., horticulturist is really bad at grasses. I need to improve on that. That's my fault. That's my responsibility. But when I look at a prairie ecosystem, it just looks like a bunch of green out there. But I think one way to help us make that connection to our natural world, to our natural environment, is to start to explore that. Go to these nature centers, to these preserves in places where they will allow you to hike freely, and start to explore that. Start to focus on those individual plants. The prairie ecosystem up in the upper left-hand side. If you start to hang it in there just for a moment, you'll start to see differences in pattern and texture and color. I don't know if you can make it out on your view, but there's this slight pink that is peeping up from some of the muley that we see out the grasses that turning color at this time of year. Let's explore a little bit further into this. So, getting to know your location. You've seen all those images, all those wonderful images of Texas. It's a great representation of our Gulf coastal region. Of course, I didn't have a picture of the beach, but there you go. But there are, I challenge you to find out more information about your local environment. This is a sample of Brazoria County. You may have seen me present this slide in past presentations. Get to know what annual rainfall you have, what soil type you have, what you're standing on when you're out in a natural environment, when you're out in at a nature center or off of the beaten path, off of the concrete, is very, very important to understand what that is. It will dictate or tell you what plants can work in our area. Now, we know for those folks who are around here, Brazos River divides the county, our county, Brazoria County, into 1/3 is covered by hardwoods, and the rest is generally coastal prairie land. And we've got a suite of plants that we have coursing through here. Everything from upland species like pin oaks, hackberry, mulberry, etc., pecan trees. Don't forget the state tree of Texas. And then we have creek bottoms as well, the other extreme. Sedges, cordgrasses, native grasses. It's very, very dynamic out there. So one resource that you can go to find a little bit more information about your soil type. You've heard this information from Stephen Yannock when he was talking about fruit trees. You've heard other horticulturists, if you're a repeat offender, if you're a repeat visitor with our program, you've heard us say this, and we're going to continue to say to provide these resources to you. I think that redundancy is the best teacher, and certainly I ask that you go to some of these websites and explore that. USDA, Natural Resources Conservation Service, provides a web soil survey, and you can go online and find information about that. And guess where else you can go to find that information about your local environment? That's right. Contact your local extension office. We're here to help you. Maybe there's not a horticulturist in Matagorda County. That's fine. Call me up. I'm in a neighboring county. But the Ag and Natural Resources agents will have that information for you. Just because there's not a horticulturist assigned to a county doesn't mean that it means that we still have staff that are well versed in our local ecosystem in the area. So please contact us. We really, really would appreciate the opportunity to serve you. So here in the prairie, like I said, you look out of the prairie as just a wash of green. But if you stand there long enough, you start to see patterns in nature. You start to elicit some of that information that distinguishes some of those plants from other plants. When I was out there, I got to see a wonderful I started picking out little pieces of yellow out of the prairie, and I started to see Texas coneflower and tall goldenrod. Both of these plants are blooming at this time of year. Herbaceous plants that we often take for granted. By the way, goldenrod, if you have an allergy, it's going to be to ragweed, not goldenrod. I heard that when I was growing up culturally, the goldenrod, you're allergic to goldenrod. That's not true. The pollen, the tiny pollen is supported in ragweed, and oftentimes you'll see that in a community, right? So think of the prairie and all of these other environments that I'm talking about as a community of plants. These plants are successful growing where they are naturally distributed because of a balanced ecosystem because there's so much diversity out there. There's an association with animals that visit those plants. We can get to learn a little bit more by visiting some of these places and talking with our staff at Extension. Maybe you're going through the woodland, a beautiful trail. You get a little bit of sunlight, dappled sunlight that comes through the canopy, and you will start to see plants like frostweed, which is blooming right now, or Turk's cap. Turk's cap is one of those rock stars. It's one plant that we've accepted into another program that we host called the Texas Superstar Program, a list of plants that we've developed along with the Texas Nursery and Landscape Association and Texas Department of Agriculture to identify these plants that will do well in across a larger breadth of Texas. You'll be successful with the majority of plants that we have in the Texas Superstar catalog. So go to that website and check it out. Frostweed you may not be familiar with. Frostweed is a unique understory plant. I think it's a member of the sunflower family. Excuse me, I got a cough really quick. There, mute off. Anyway, frostweed is a wonderful native plant that is in the deep understory of a woodland area. You won't see it until it starts pumping these white flowers, and they're pumping a lot of nectar. A great resource for those animals that are cruising through at this time of year. Maybe you've got migratory hummingbirds that are coming through, or you have other bees, butterflies, beetles, other insects that will be attracted to those flowers for their resource. Let's talk about the bottomlands. You come from around here. If you come from around here, you're from around Houston, the Houston area. We've got a lot of Brazoria County. There are a lot of areas that do have saturated soils or have the potential for saturated soils, bottomlands. And there's quite a diversity, even in the deep understory of a forest or in the bottomlands where there's very little sunlight coming through. Plants like this iconic one, our own palm tree, the sable palm. Wonderful iconic species. I took this picture this weekend. I got lucky with the light playing through the fan of leaves. I mean, it's just gorgeous. You can, if this plant is appropriate for your area, and I do make that distinction, get to know where you're at. Maybe most of us, I'm sure, live in an urban area. We may not have the benefit of living in a rural area or an area where we have natural areas. But there is no reason that we cannot incorporate some of these plants that I'll be talking about today into our landscape. I implore you to try to understand the larger picture. These vegetative zones, these ecosystems that are supporting the native plants and the animals that do visit them, then draw that back into yourself. I love lists, and I love for people to do research for me. But certainly I like to explore that myself. We do have resources at the very end of this. We'll provide you links to plant lists that have already been created that may be more appropriate for your area if you're closer to the coast. The South Texas unit of the Native Plant Society of Texas has created 2 lists of native plants appropriate for landscaping. That is one for sandy soils and one for clay soils. And it's developed specifically around the coast. If you have challenges with saline soils, there may be some plants on there that would be appropriate for your home landscape. So let's talk about the plants, right? Everybody has their own favorite flower. Some folks that I talk to, Joe Smith off the street, I'll ask that person, what's your favorite flower? Oftentimes I get a rose, because they're so iconic. They're just there. If I talk to some of my native plant enthusiasts, they may talk about this plant up on the upper right-hand corner. It's not a plant that you'll see down here on the coastal area, but I thought I'd point it out to you. You may be familiar with that purple flowering plant in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. That is, okay, I'll give you a hint. There's an ice cream that was named after that flower. That's right, that's what a bluebell looks like. We're looking dead on to this beautiful large cup-shaped flower. We had a great blooming of that particular flower across the, I'm not sure what it's called. It's the pastures and prairies as you go out towards College Station, right? So it's not coastal at all. and it may not be appropriate to try to plant here. There are issues with germination of the seed. You may not be able to find seed, etc. But I just thought I'd let you know what a bluebell flower looks like. The one in the upper left-hand corner, you may be more familiar with. It's a member of the Scrophulariaceae. It's a plant family that's called the figwort family. But it's a beautiful, iconic plant that we call Indian paintbrush. Oftentimes, you'll see Indian paintbrush glowing and growing right alongside a bluebonnet. Interesting thing about you didn't know you're going to get a science lesson with this presentation, but the interesting thing about the Indian paintbrush is it's hemiparasitic. It's known to grow its roots into the underground vegetative matter of other plants. So it's taking a little bit off of those companion plants that it's growing next to. Pretty interesting. That doesn't mean it's killing a plant that it's next to. It's just a way that particular plant has evolved over eons, centuries of time. But it's glorious, and I just love Indian paintbrush. It reminds me of a season. It reminds me of home, of being here in Texas. There's other plants that we won't introduce to you today. We'll focus on the button bush, which is the middle pictured on the lower row. The one on the left-hand side, we call it purple leather flower. That is more of a plant that you'll see in calcareous soils in central Texas. And then it's a kind of open-faced purple flower on the lower left-hand side. Great plant for hummingbirds when they're coming through central Texas. One we may be more familiar with on the lower right-hand side is a wine cup. That's what a wine cup looks like. And there's what is it? There's like 5 species of wine cups in Texas. Pretty cool. All right, let's keep on going. So, some of the plants that you thank you. That was a great introduction to the next slide. So some of the plants that we'll be looking at that may be appropriate for where you live in Texas. Again, get to know where you're at and what your native soils are like. That will help you to be more successful with some of the plants that we'll be talking about today. Now, this is a large tree. It's called American holly. It's a beautiful member of the holly family. It is a tree that can take moist, well-drained, more acidic soil. So when we say acidic soils, there's a pH range for soils. 7 is a balanced pH. Below that, it's acidic, right? Here in Brazoria County, we're average about 6.5 on the pH scale. So a plant like American holly would work really, really well here in our area. The challenge that American holly has, and again, it has the potential to get fairly large, depending on the richness of the soil that you have. If it has the optimal conditions, it can get to be up to 50 feet tall. But in general, in urban areas, we don't see them taller than about 30 feet at the most. So you can keep it, trimmed low. They have more of a conical shape. If you think about it, it's a fastigious. The word is fastigiate, meaning it just grows straight up and down, right? It has more of it's not a spreading canopy, it has more of a conical shape to the canopy itself. Now, it can exist in clay soils, but in areas like Houston, where we have high humidity, you may have to try to find a cultivar like savanna that will work for you. Now, the interesting thing about this plant family that American holly falls under, and it produces berries, right? But that's almost like a trick statement. They will produce berries, but you have to get the right sex, right? So let's go on. The next plant that I'll feature, which is in the same plant family, and this is distinctive to this plant family, is Yaupon. Has that wonderful name, botanical name, Ilex vomitoria. I don't have time to go into the history of why it was called vomitoria. Suffice to say, it's in the same plant family as American holly. The interesting thing about members of this family, they are what we call dioecious, Dioecious, dioecious. Say that 5 times fast. That means that one single plant will have all flowers that produce one set of reproductive organs, one gender reproductive organs. One plant will have all flowers that produce male flowers, in essence. You know, they'll produce the structures that provide the pollen as a resource. And a separate plant, individual plant, will produce flowers that are all female, that will have a pistil in them. What does that mean? That means that if you're going to a nursery, you really have to rely on the information that they have. If you're going to a nursery and you're expecting a yaupon to have berries on it or to bear berries, right? Or American holly, you're going to want, and you want to see berries on it, you're going to have the staff at that nursery are going to have to know what that plant is, right? Is it a female? Is it male? There is quality control at nurseries, you know, so staff will know, just giving you a little bit of information ahead of the game. Yaupon, it is a tree, but we consider it to be a multi-trunk tree. In other words, it produces many, many different trunks on it. If you're doing a drive-by down Highway 35 in Brazoria County, I will ask if there's anyone on this session today, if you can please mute your microphone. It's a little distracting for me, but thank you very much. So it is a multi-trunk specimen. It does have a shrub-like shape to it, right? And the cool thing about yaupon is it will exist in variable soils. You'll see it naturally distributed across towards central Texas, a little bit north up towards Dallas. Really, you see a lot of it here along our roadsides. So a little bit of scientific information for you. Members of this plant family that yaupon and American holly fall under are dioecious. Now, we discussed this with my colleagues yesterday. We thought we'd present a plant to you that probably will not work well for you in our area. Now, you may, if you live down towards Corpus Christi or even if you're in Brazoria County, you actually may have planted or may have an eastern persimmon. Okay, it is a plant that it's a plant that can get very tall. Again, in our urban environment, typically there's a lot of stress and pressure in the big city, right? There's pollution, there's compaction from foot traffic, sometimes from vehicular traffic. If you're working on your car in the middle of your lawn, which you should not be, right? You've got compaction issues on that soil, and that's going to affect the plants that are planted in that environment. So there are stressors in the urban environment. At its best, it has the potential to get to be 100 feet. That means if you're going to put a tree like eastern persimmon or any of the others that I talked about, you're going to want to value that information and get to know that information to know where to put it in your landscape. So eastern persimmon, while it will exist on variable soil types, it doesn't handle it well in calcareous soil. So it does much better in a slightly lower pH, right around 6.5. It is very intolerant of saline soil. So if you're living close to the coast and you have issues with saline soils, this is not the plant for you. Now, this is in a different plant family than the two members of the holly family that I talked about. I can't remember what plant family this one is in, but all persimmons are dioecious. Well, this persimmon is dioecious, meaning one plant has all male flowers and another individual have all female flowers. I've also given information about when we can expect it to bloom, so we know when it'll produce fruit. They do produce edible fruit. It has more of a conical shape to it as well, very, very tall. But again, consider where you're at in the world. This is where this plant exists, naturally distributed in Texas. I pulled this map from the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. They also have a plants database where you can go online, plug in information about any taxonomic or common name, the botanical name or common names of plants, and you can elicit information about where that plant might be naturally distributed in Texas. They offer information on native plants as well as introduced plants. So for eastern persimmon, you can kind of get its range. You can kind of see its range. While we're right on the border of its range, Harris County, it's reported to be there. Harris County hosts a huge city called Houston, and while it may occur in parts of that county, it may not be appropriate to plant in parts of that county, and it's all related to soil type. Kidneywood. I really dig kidneywood. It's a really neat shrub that I was introduced to when I was in Central Texas. The larger shrub can get to be about 15 feet tall. It is multi-trunked. You do have to give it some room. I would treat it, if you do plant this out, I would treat it like a background hedge or a hedge, maybe a neighbor's hedge. uh, a hedge you want to, maybe you don't want to know everything that's going on in your neighbor's yard. Um, it does produce clusters of tightly packed white flowers, very, very small, but they are very fragrant. And this plant is very drought tolerant. So you may be in a part of which county you're in that you do have an issue. You do have problems with rain. You don't get a lot of rain in the area that you're at. This plant performs very well and blooms throughout a longer period. Interesting thing about kidneywood is very highly attractant to bees. I'm not afraid of bees. I love bees. I think they're important. They're a very, very important part of our ecology. There's a lot of native bees, and then there's the European honeybee, which is naturalized now. We might as well call it a native now, but they're highly attracted to this. So if you're a beekeeper, maybe a plant like this would be more important for you. Buttonbush. I love buttonbush. I apologize. I didn't take a picture of the entire shrub, but they can get pretty broad and tall. They have long arching stems on them. They get to be about 15 feet tall at their best capacity. They are multi-trunk plants. They will exist in saturated soils if it dries out a little bit. In the Austin area, I saw some along some of the creeks up there, and it was dry as a bone during certain areas, and these plants were doing just fine. But they will exist as a marginal emergent plant. They will exist on the side of a river or a creek, or in an area where you have shallow water. If you have a larger pond, you might put it right on the edge where the roots can grow right into the water, and it's just happy as a clam. It does have a blooming period. These clusters of flowers, they're about, I'd say about 2 inches in diameter at the most, and they're producing a lot. They're pumping a lot of nectar, and those plants are covered in pollinators. A great resource for those animals that are coming through at a time when they need these resources the most. Maybe you've got a place in your yard to place a plant like buttonbush. Even if you don't, at least you've been introduced to this wonderful native shrub. Salt marshmallow. This is more of an herbaceous, a semi-woody plant. It is a member of the mallow family. It is a hibiscus. You know, think of it that way. It does have a different botanical name, Costoletskia virginica. If you come across naturalists or maybe someone from the Native Plant Society, they may call it by Costoletskia. They may call it by its genera, right? Its genus, the first name of the botanical name. But we know it is salt marshmallow. And I've seen them on ditch side on the roads and in ponds going up towards East Texas. They can handle saturated soils. They're a beautiful herbaceous member of the mallow family, producing those iconic hibiscus-like flowers. They're about, I'd say, what is that, about 5-6 inches in diameter. And they'll have a great blooming period throughout the summer. Gorgeous plant that I'd ask you to consider. There are some that are sold seasonally at some nurseries that you may be affiliated with. Turk's cap. We got to talk about the rock stars, or the iconic plants that we may know of the native plant world. Turk's cap, semi-woody plant. They can get pretty tall. Oftentimes you'll see them existing in partial shaded areas of the woodland. So a dappled shade woodland's edge. They'll bloom a little bit better if they get a little bit better sun exposure. They will still bloom in full shade, and they can exist in full shade, but I tend to give them a little bit of, right on the edge. You can plant them out in full sun, but you will see their leaves droop, right? They will go through a period where they're just trying to conserve as much water as they can. That doesn't mean they're going to die. It just means that, they can handle variable soil type. And they will bloom. I know I put information that says May through October. Typically, I'll see them bloom in late spring, when the hummingbirds are coming through, they're blooming at a time when, you know, when when those birds are coming through, when those migratory species are coming through, and then we'll have a great show in fall. I took this picture out at the Armand Bayou this past weekend. Beautiful little turban-shaped flowers. It is a member of the hibiscus family. It is think of the hibiscus. So you see the Kosteletskia, the salt marshmallow. Check this out. Same thing, right? It's got the same kind of floristic structures, the same number of petals, the same reproductive organs that are sticking up like a tongue out of that flower. It's the petals are just clasped around each other to provide this Turk's cap look. Now we do have one of these plants that has been found by one of our horticulturists, Greg Grant, up in Tyler, when he was working for one of the nurseries in introducing new plants. He helped to discover one that we have listed as a Texas superstar called Pam's Pink, named after Pam Purrier from I believe she was with the Rose Rustlers, or the Native Plant Society. Oh, I can't remember. My apologies, Greg. But Turk's Cap, Pam's Pink, it's a little bit more lanky than the species plant, than the red flowering variety. But certainly it may work for you in your landscape. Just give it a slight bit of room. It will sprawl a little bit, have long arching stems. Now, some of these plants like Turk's Cap and Turk's Cap Pam's Pink, they may die back in the wintertime. Not to worry, friends. Those plants are perennials. In Central Texas, where I was cultivating Turk's Cap, the stems would always die back to the ground, and I just cut them back, and they'd come right back in the spring. We don't have those kind of challenges that we did in Central Texas. We have less challenges with hard freezes where I'm at, but certainly it's an appropriate. These are appropriate plants for our landscapes, for our collective landscapes, and they do provide a little fruit that you can eat. They're kind of mealy. They taste like an apple, and they've got these 4 large seeds. But if you're in the forest and you need something to nosh on, you might consider it. Now, there's a caveat with that. If you're traveling through a natural area and you see a fruit, get to know what that plant is before you eat the fruit. Don't just go eating. Stephen says, don't go eating anything in the forest. You've got to know what those plants are. We don't want you to cause yourself ill health or those friends around you that you're introducing to those plants. Here's another herbaceous plant that I don't see that often in people's landscapes, but it's very appropriate for our area. It's a penstemon. Produces a tiny little flower that's about, from the stem to stern, from the opening of that flower to the back part of that inflorescence, that single flower. It is about an inch, but it's producing clusters. It's a small little shrub or mounding form herbaceous perennial called Gulf Coast penstemon, and it can get to be about 1 to 2 feet tall, and it can exist in various soils. And it will bloom, it has the potential to bloom from March through June. It can handle it in dappled shade. It does really well with a little bit of shade, and it'll certainly work for you. Now, for this particular penstemon, it will reseed itself regularly. Can that be problematic? Not really. If the plant is not so aggressive that it will not disrupt your local ecosystem, right? Your local ecology, and you can easily remove those plants that you don't want for this plant. So it is a native plant as well, and very appropriate for our area. Of course, another iconic plant, salvia, tropical sage. This is Salvia coccinea. Salvia coccinea is the botanical name. The first name is the genera. The second name is the species. These are Latinized words. This is not pure Latin, right? These are Latinized words that are attributed to the plant. Each plant will have a botanical name associated with it. That tells us that that plant is exactly what we expect it to be, right? It's a specific identifier for a plant. Now, we can call some plants salvia or sage. And when you go to a nursery, you may have to be very specific with a botanical name to back up what you think you're buying, especially if it's not in flower. So the common name for this plant is tropical sage. Even though it has the species name of coccinea, which we associate with the color red, this particular tropical sage will come in different colors. I've seen tropical sage pink. I've seen tropical sage in white. I haven't seen a yellow, but beautiful little small herbaceous plant. It is treated sometimes as an annual, depends on how much cold exposure you get in the winter time. But it will bloom intermittently from spring to fall. And I just love this particular salvia. I think it's gorgeous. They don't get very tall. Folks, we're going to wind up this presentation with a view of the pasture prairie. This is a view of goldenrod in its prime. I don't know what species of goldenrod that is, but the one that I did see out at the Armand Bayou is one called tall goldenrod. There's several different species that are distributed throughout Texas. This one is species altissima. Tall goldenrod, we will see it in our pasture and prairies. It is a plant that tells us where we're at, right? Some of these plants are so iconic, like bluebonnets. When you mention bluebonnets, when you go outside of your county and you mention a bluebonnet, everybody knows what a bluebonnet is. And I would say the same thing about goldenrod. I know this is a reliable plant that will bloom in my pasture, has the potential to bloom in my lawn if I get seed for it every year in the fall. They're just glorious plants. I just love that sunshine color that's coming off of them. They can get, like this one, can get up to be about 4 feet tall. The inflorescence will get to be about 4 feet tall. But typically they're a fall bloomer, and they will grow in a pasture ecology or pasture soils, prairie soils quite readily. Folks, I've got some websites that I'd like to introduce you to. We at Aggie Horticulture, we're always here to help you be successful in your gardening. And I ask you to visit us at aggie-horticulture.tamu.edu. We have a variety of information available to you to help you be successful. Now, Aggie Horticulture did build in honor of Benny Simpson, who helped start the Native Plant Society of Texas, built a website devoted to some of those plants that Benny so loved. It's a list of Texas native trees that are available at that specific website. When we're thinking about native plants, I don't know about you, but when I think about native plants, I often think of these flowering plants. And sometimes we tend to bypass other plants that are very, very important part of our pastures and our prairies, even of woodland areas, of some of those grasses that are part of that, of a balanced and healthy ecosystem. Or trees. And here's a place where you can go examine some of those trees that you may consider for your home landscape. Now, the information on there, the taxonomy is a little old. We still have work to do to bring it up to speed as far as the current botany on it, but the information is very valid. So I ask you to go visit Benny Simpson's Texas Native Trees. Don't forget Earthkind Landscaping. We provide quality information to help you garden and landscape in a more sustainable fashion. We want you to use less resources, to use resources appropriate for your circumstance, to practices for watering your plants, etc. Just visit us at Earthkind Landscaping at that particular website. There are places where you can find information about gardening. Houston Arboretum has a butterfly gardening list. So they talk about butterfly gardening, and they will present information of native and appropriate and non-native but appropriate plants to put in your garden to attract some of those pollinators. And of course, the Native Plant Society of Texas has this wonderful resource where they're talking about sandy and clay soils and plants available for that. I worked for a little while at the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, and it was just an outstanding experience. I really enjoyed it while I was there. They do have up-to-date information on native plants of Texas. So I ask you to visit their website. They have a very strong native plant information database, and they're there to provide you with information to help you be a successful gardener as well. Don't forget your county agents. because we're here to help you. There's other publications that you can check out at some point if you're into botanizing on your own. Certainly there's a book that was put out by Gayata Agilis, Wildflowers of Texas. Very color tabs on the document itself. You can go out and explore some of those plants. Paul Cox and Patty Leslie Pasteur, I believe is her name. Now they developed this book called Texas Friendly Guide. It's all illustrated, but it's an appropriate resource to view. And then, of course, other books that you can check out. This presentation will be available to you as a recording after this session today. Boone and Ginger, I'm available for questions if anybody has any.
Stephen B., I think you've been very informative, and we've just had a couple logistics questions up till now. Early on, a question on the slide of multiple types of flowers. The one in the middle at the top was American basket flower.
No, actually, that was one that we call sensitive briar. It's a mimosa.
No, if you go back to that slide real quick.
Okay, I'm gonna have to. Rather than bail, I'll tell you what. I'll just do this.
Yeah.
Okay. There we go. So the one in the middle upper row.
Yes.
So that one is that's called sensitive briar. It's a true mimosa.
Okay, cool. Well, I was thrown off by it. I didn't see the foliage there.
Yeah, very, very. Yeah, it's almost like, looking at a picture of Godzilla. These the images of the plants are not to scale, but it's a tiny little koosh ball shaped flower pumping a lot of nectar. Curious thing about sensitive briar, you can do this with children or with adults. If you touch the leaves of the plants, they have this response where they just close right up and clasp right up. It's so cool. That is a member of the pea family. Did y'all know, dear viewer, that there are 3 different flowering types within the pea family? One is the bluebonnet that we know, the little hooded flower. Mountain laurel, another native plant or shrub tree, is in that side of the family and produce these wonderful hood-shaped purple flowers. Another subfamily of this plant family, the pea family, produces these koosh ball-shaped flowers, a mimosa type flower. And then there's another member of the subfamily that's more tropical. They're the oddball, like the orchid tree belongs in that side of the family. Any other questions?
Yes, we did have one. Sources for some of these more obscure native plants. The question was on the button bush. I know it's going to be limited to a certain type of nursery that would carry those.
That's very correct, Boone. Thank you. So some nurseries may carry seed for plants like wine cup, or they actually may carry like hanging baskets of that particular flower. The Indian paintbrush up on the upper left-hand side, you're going to want to get seed for that, or just rely on the beauty as you're driving 80 miles an hour down the highway and botanizing at 80 miles an hour, enjoying that view as you go through towards the hill country if you're traveling. Some more obscure plants like Texas leatherflower, the one on the lower left-hand side, again, that's more for calcareous soils, which we really don't have in our county, in Brazoria County. You may have to wait for a sale of your local chapter of the Native Plant Society of Texas, for instance. There are local chapters which we encourage you to explore. Native Plant Society of Texas. They do have colleagues in our profession that are affiliated with that organization, as well as a lot of well-versed and well-practiced practitioners, I guess, or lay people. But there are chapters throughout Texas, and they will have plant sales and carry some of these, as we call them, more esoteric or hard to find plants. You'll just have to keep your eye on them. Also check your local nurseries and to see if they will carry them as well. There's one in the middle in central Houston. I'm not going to name it right now, not to show preference, but I would check in with your local nurseries just to see if they have the potential for carrying some of these plants. It's all about supply and demand. If a nursery doesn't get enough demand, they won't provide the supply. And so, honestly, some of the plants also are blooming seasonally. They do have challenges with propagation, like the bluebell that I told you about earlier. So rely on those lists that are provided to you. There's also I didn't put this in my bibliography, but Harris County Extension, Harris County Master Gardeners, the Extension Office did put together a great list of native plants. So you may want to visit their website and check out those plant lists as well. Galveston County, if you're in Brazoria area, I believe they've built out a suite of plants that are appropriate for our area too. Brazoria County, we're still working on it, but we hope to have lists for you soon as well.
Stephen, I think that's about all the questions. We just had questions about native plant nurseries and seed sources, online seed sources for native seeds.
Excellent. Check in with your local extension office. There's 2 places that I know of that sell seed. There's a Native American Seed out in Junction. They do have an online store. There's also another one right outside of Fredericksburg. I can't remember the name of it at the moment. I apologize to those.
Stephen, Wild Seed Farm?
That's it, Wild Seed Farm. They do carry native seed as well as non-native seed as well. Just get to know, look at some of these resources and get to know what you're buying. But certainly they're 2 reliable resources where you can buy seed for plant in Texas. And I believe there's another one up north around Denton, but I can't think of it at the moment.
Well, that's fantastic, Stephen. I'd like to let you cruise out of here. I know you need to be in another place in the world here in the next 10 minutes. So thank you very much, Stephen. This is a great presentation. And I will do the conclusion, and me, Ginger, and I think we have Kevin on here as well. We will entertain any questions in a dialogue moving forward. Thank you, Stephen.
All right. Thank you. And thank you all for viewing today.
Okay, as you can see from the slide here, upcoming next week is yours truly on the 14th. I will be discussing diversifying your tree canopy, and this is based off of my experiences here in Fort Bend County of trying to get away from planting of live oaks and Bradford pears and crepe myrtles, and looking at all the other beautiful suitable trees, native and adapted trees that will grow well along the Gulf Coast. So make sure you tune in for that. As well, you will be receiving a follow-up email from Stephen Brueggerhoff in the next coming days that will have a link to this presentation online. So if you missed anything, you can go back and review it. Also, he will send a link to a very short online survey, and we ask you please to just take probably a maximum of 2 or 3 minutes to complete that survey, and that helps us identify new topics and to make these presentations better moving forward. So with that, we will, if you have specific questions, I'd say we can go ahead and turn our mics on, and you can ask those questions if you have them now.